What we wanted to do for our first panel was bring together a group of researchers who are thinking through elements of the positive peace framework, and to comment a little bit on the work that they're doing that fits in with various pillars of peace, or that are thinking about the pillars of peace and the framework as a whole, or people who are working on some of the elements that we heard Steve mention: nonviolent resistance. We want to hear a little bit about the role of memory and culture and meaning and how that can be infused within the pillars. We also heard a little bit about the need to have community level indicators and understandings, and we'll hear a little bit about that. So what I'm going to ask the panel to do is to go through their sort of opening remarks. We'll have a short discussion, and we'll also take questions from you guys. So I'll introduce our panel now. Dr. Stephen Zunes, who is Professor of Politics and International Studies at University of San Francisco. He's also a member of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, their academic council. Dr. Naomi Levy, Assistant Professor of the Political Science Department at Santa Clara University and lead quantitative investigator at Everyday Peace Indicators. Dr. Pushpa Iyer, Assistant Professor and Director of the Center for Conflict Studies at Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And Dr. Ev Mead, who's a Professor of Practice at the Kroc School of Peace Studies at University of San Diego. So I'd like to start with you, Stephen.
Thank you. I've been struck by the fact that the countries which have been able to more firmly establish positive peace after living under decades of corrupt, violent, authoritarian governments have been those in which largely nonviolent means of civil resistance by their own people have forced change in a large number of these cases. And when we think back, it was not the leftist guerrillas, the New People's Army, that brought down the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, but nuns praying the rosary in front of the regime's tanks and millions of others who brought Greater Manila to a standstill. It was not 11 weeks of NATO bombing that brought down Slobodan Milosevic, the infamous butcher of the Balkans. It was a nonviolent movement led by young students whose generation had been sacrificed in a series of bloody military engagements against neighboring Yugoslav republics, who were able to mobilize a large cross-section of the population to rise up against a stolen election. It was not the armed wing of the African National Congress that brought majority rule to South Africa. It was workers, students, township dwellers who, through the use of strikes, boycotts, and creation of alternative institutions and other acts of defiance, made it impossible for apartheid system to continue. It was not NATO that brought down the communist regimes of Eastern Europe and freed the Baltic republics from Soviet control. It was Polish dock workers, East German church people, Estonian folk singers, Czech intellectuals, and millions of ordinary citizens. Similarly, such such tyrants as Jean-Claude Duvalier in Haiti, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, King Gyanendra in Nepal, General Suharto in Indonesia, Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia, and dictators from Bolivia to Benin, from Madagascar to the Maldives, were forced to step down when it became clear that they were powerless in the face of massive nonviolent resistance and cooperation. And history's shown that in most cases, strategic nonviolent action can be more effective than armed struggle, and as well as more effective than hoping for reform from above. A recent Freedom House study showed how of nearly 70 countries that had made the transition from dictatorship to democracy over the past 40 years, only a small minority did through armed struggle from below or reform instigated from above. Hardly any new democracies emerged from foreign invasion. In nearly 3/4 of the transitions, change was rooted in democratic civil society organizations that employed nonviolent methods. Similarly, in the highly acclaimed book, How Civil Resistance Works, authors Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan noted how of the nearly 350 major insurrections in support of self-determination and democratic rule over the past century, primarily violent means was successful only 26% of the time, whereas primarily nonviolent struggles with primarily nonviolent methods were successful at 53% of the time, more than twice as much. And similarly, the successful nonviolent struggles averaged 2 years, while the successful armed struggles averaged 8 years. On top of that, the odds of creating a democratic, stable society within 5 years were significantly lower in victorious armed struggles as opposed to nonviolent struggles. Nonviolent action has been a powerful tool even in reversing coup d'etats. In Bolivia in 1979, Argentina in 1986, Haiti in 1990, Russia in 1991, Burkina Faso in 2016, coups have been reversed when the plotters realized that after people took to the streets, that physically controlling key buildings and institutions did not mean they actually had power. The periodic claims one hears by autocratic-minded leaders that foreign governments or NGOs are somehow responsible for protests and civil resistance movements. I've looked into this, and there's no credible evidence to support these charges. Even in cases where opposition groups are provided some outside funding, people generally will not take to the streets and put their bodies on the line unless they are truly motivated to do so. Where countries like the United States can make a difference in promoting positive peace is in ending our support for corrupt autocratic governments and those which deny self-determination to their neighbors. I was struck in reading the recently released Positive Peace report of the sizable number of countries with low levels of positive peace whose governments are provided military aid, arms transfers, police training, and/or security assistance from the United States, or have been subjected to recent or ongoing U.S. military intervention. It's indeed ironic that the United States, founded on such principles as political freedom and the rule of law, is the world's #1 backer of authoritarian regimes and occupation armies. The United States has no moral credibility to speak out authoritarianism in Iran, Cuba, or Venezuela, while we support even worse dictatorships in Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, and elsewhere. Similarly, we have no credibility to challenge Russia's occupation of Crimea, while we continue to support the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory or Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara. The best way those of us in the United States can do to support positive peace is to force our government to stop supporting authoritarian regimes and occupation armies. Indeed, I'd argue that the country in which large-scale nonviolent resistance would have the greatest impact in promoting positive peace around the world would probably be here in the United States. There's probably no single issue in which the divide between public opinion and government policy is larger than this question. Americans support functioning governments, a sound business environment, equitable distribution of resources, the acceptance of rights of others, good relations with neighbors, the free flow of information, high levels of human capital, and low levels of corruption. You can't have that if you are living under authoritarian governments or military occupation. By supporting such governments, the United States is helping deny people these rights and benefits, and most Americans believe this is wrong. Change can occur, however. Popular movements succeeded in ending U.S. support for the murderous Salvadoran junta and the Nicaraguan Contras, ending the horrific wars in those countries, and getting the United States to finally impose sanctions in apartheid South Africa that helped end white minority rule, and stopping U.S. support for Indonesia's brutal occupation of Timor-Leste, which led to that country's freedom, and in ending or at least limiting support for a number of dictatorships which have helped make possible democratization and more positive peace. Reasonable people can disagree as to what role the United States can play in promoting positive peace directly. However, I hope we can all agree that, in the words of the Hippocratic Oath, first, do no harm. We have seen how nonviolent resistance has proven successful even under brutal dictatorships. Let's utilize these skills to get our government to end its support for those who deny the benefits of positive peace to their citizens and others.
Given that we see this relationship between countries that have weaker levels of positive peace having the vast majority of unsuccessful violent resistance movements, it really does give a good sort of evidence base to say, looking at the pillars of positive peace and looking at how we strengthen those is another way to approach fostering a society where you have the options and the institutions and the structures that allow for nonviolent resistance movements to grow and to have a place. So thank you for your comments. We're going to turn now to Naomi.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to be telling you all today a bit about a collaboration that I'm currently engaged in with Allard Duursma and Pamina Ferschau. This is part of a much larger research program known as the Everyday Peace Indicators Project. And I'm actually going to spend most of my time talking about what I'll sometimes refer to as EPI methodology. But I'll also talk a bit about what in early work with EPI we found was lacking with EPI, and which led us to the need to try to scale up what we were doing with EPI. So I'm going to briefly be describing a pilot project we're currently launching in Colombia. Okay, so I want to start by just talking about how EPI differs from the Global Peace Index and the Positive Peace Index. And that is that what usually we do when we try to measure something that's large and abstract like peace is to think about what do we mean by these concepts. A panel of experts might get together, or we might do a literature review, or we might look like the PPI does at sort of empirical correlates of the concepts we're interested in. But usually this is done by experts sitting in DC or London or a capital city far away from the communities where the research would actually eventually be carried out. What EPI does that's really different is that it asks locals to conceptualize these concepts instead. And so what the project does, oops, sorry about that. What the project does is asks locals to answer the question, how do you know whether your own society is more or less at peace? And it proceeds in 4 steps. Now today, I don't have enough time to take you through all 4 of those steps. I'm going to focus more on the first 2. But basically the idea here is to turn to locals to tap into their indigenous technical knowledge, as we refer to it. And so we begin in the first step by asking people what indicators they use in their everyday lives to figure out whether they are more or less at peace. And so we begin by convening focus groups, and we just ask them the question, how do you know whether you are more or less at peace? What are the signs you look to? And the important point here is that we're not just asking them to come up with indicators for our use. We're asking them what they're already using in their everyday lives. What we find when we convene these focus groups is that we get a whole long list of indicators that people use. Just the signs that they look for, whether or not there are children playing, whether or not dogs are barking at night. These are the sorts of things people turn to figure out whether or not there is peace in their community. So here are some examples. This is also some pictures from research we've done in Uganda and Colombia. But the kinds of indicators that come up have to do with whether or not the bodas can travel to certain areas, or whether or not traditional festivals are going on, right? These are things that experts are not going to come up with. This is a highly localized sort of knowledge that we gain. Okay, so after we've gone through that first step of producing a long list of indicators, what we do next is to try to narrow the list down to the ones that are most indicative of peace in a community. And that's the second step, the verify stage. Here, we turn to the entire community and we bring them the long list of indicators that we extract from the focus group transcripts, and we ask the community which of these indicators matter most. The community has a discussion and eventually votes using Post-it notes on big poster boards for which indicators matter most. Once we've done that, we usually will have about 20 everyday peace indicators for each of our communities. We then can go through and analyze what does this community need, and then maybe design interventions to help increase peace in that community. And then track over time how peace has changed in that community. So eventually, we produce surveys that can take a longitudinal measure of peace in that community to see whether or not interventions are working or not. So it's a really powerful measurement and evaluation tool. The problem with it, you guys might have already come up with this yourselves, is that every community has a different set of indicators. So while we can make overtime comparisons in any one community, we can't compare across communities that easily. So that's where our Scaling Up project comes in, and I don't have a lot of time to tell you about it, but we were approached by a group in Colombia that wanted to use our EPI methodology. This is an organization of indigenous women in Colombia, and they wanted to produce a participatory barometer of peace to monitor the implementation of the peace accord. And so partnering with them and a local organization, we are piloting an approach to try to produce at least a regional measure of peace among the Pasto indigenous group in Colombia. So I won't go into all the details of it, but basically out of 32 different resguardos in which the Pasto live, we have selected 6 of the communities for them to do the full EPI process. Once they've finished doing that, that's underway currently. Once they've finished doing that, what we're trying to pilot in this program is whether that verification step can happen using a survey methodology. So we'll take the EPI that are produced in all those 6 different resguardos and enter them into a survey that we'll use in lots of other communities to see if the bottom-up indicators that are developed in one community or a bunch of different communities might be applicable to other communities as well. So we're hoping to kind of start from the ground up and build a more regional measure or barometer that can be used to track peace over time in this area. Okay, so I want to end by just saying that there's a lot of questions that remain. In fact, we realize that this pilot scaling project might raise more questions than it answers. And we don't know whether we can do that verification step, for example, using a survey methodology. We don't know if eventually we'll be able to have this cross-community and overtime comparisons, but we hope it will. And the last, this is very much experimental work. It's pilot work. We're hoping that we can bring our very localized picture of peace into conversation with more top-down measures like the PPI or the GPI. I'll end now with just a little plug for my co-author, Pamina's book, which tells you a lot more about the Everyday Peace Indicators project. And also, this slide has our website. You can read more about EPI. Thank you so much.
It will be quite interesting when we get a chance, hopefully, to overlay some of our metrics against yours and see what we can find out, and also see how that provokes conversation at the community level. So next we'll hear from Pushpa.
I've done a lot of work in India in the slums and among the very marginalized and the poor. So going by one of the questions asked earlier, I was very interested in studying more with the PPI to really see what does it look like in the community level. It's pretty similar to, I think, some of the things Naomi was sharing. And in fact, very interestingly, as you were talking about it, I'm a very qualitative researcher, so don't use the quantitative means, but precisely that is the question that I tend to ask whenever I step out on research is, what does peace mean to you? And you get those wide range of responses from the community, in terms of, whether it's my child can have milk every day, or can I walk on the street without being afraid of, my leg being blown up, to the degree of saying, do I have the freedom to talk to whoever I want? And so the range is so varied in terms of how contextual it can be, but also in terms of how communities experience and understand what the meaning of peace is. So I go with the idea of asking what are some of the challenges then if we want to really get to where people want to be, which is, can I talk to anybody I want? Can I get the food I want? Or can I walk where I want to go? What are some of those challenges? And it seems often that many of those challenges, or many of the ways that people think that those needs could be met with this idea of simple, basic needs that human beings have, that come up always to the forefront. It's always the idea that if I could meet some of those very basic human needs that I have, then I would be one step further. So if you look at the positive peace indexes that are out there, the various indicators, it seems like the one on economic growth and development would be a good place to start at, because most societies after war or violence are struggling with the idea of how to provide those basic needs to humans. So when you start with the idea of going with economic growth and development, together with a strong government, you find that some of the things that Galtung talks about with positive peace, which is how can we ensure that there is no structural violence. So it goes beyond the idea of really saying, what can we do about these structures in these places? My research often shows that when you're talking about positive peace with the exact words of Galtung of saying really it is the absence of structural violence, that structural violence doesn't exist anymore, whether we are talking about economic growth and development or basic human needs, it gets very complicated because the very structure is often responsible for the violence in the first place to begin with. So if you're talking about such a very powerful structure that is responsible for the violence, it gets very hard to understand how economic growth and development in that particular structure could not be skewed. So if you take in the context of a country like India, especially in the state of Gujarat where I come from, you notice that the disparities very stark, very, very stark. The rich get poorer, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And that does take on, very, very concrete kinds of examples that you can see on the ground. So the more you see the visual kinds of development, the more you begin to identify development as roads and having bridges or having nice buildings or, places where new airports are coming up, the more you begin to recognize that there are people who have absolutely no similar stake in that economic growth. Their economic growth boils down to literally getting that milk, every morning, and that's all that they can think about. So I have an example in one of my research that kind of captures the idea of a violent structure in itself trying to bring us to that violent structure itself trying to bring about positive peace, is where you have a political party that is responsible for, the kinds of violence against one community, the Muslim community in Gujarat state. 10 years later, the child that was about 4 or 5 years old is now a teenager and is looking for a job, ends up finding a job with the same government that was responsible for the violence that was unleashed in the state that killed his father. So you have a mother who is, mourning the loss of her husband, but a son who says, if I do not jump on the same bandwagon of development as a slogan that this government is propagating, I'm going to lose out on it. So you can see what that kind of economic development really boils down at the community level on the ground. So that's one example that led us to think more, in our research, which I call Challenges to Peace Building, to really thinking about what is that strong government, what is that government that we are talking about that is labeled as a strong government that can build positive peace, a strong government that ensures that there's no more violence in the state, there is complete absence of violence. Internal security takes on a whole new meaning then, because it really means we have the absence of violence, but we don't really have in any ways the kinds of equity and equality that Galtung talks about a structure should provide. Right? I mean, Galtung's idea of structural removal of structural violence is the idea is that structures equity and equal, and that doesn't really come across. The other thing that Galtung also talks about with regard to structures is the idea of harmony within. He calls it harmony within. And harmony within, I kind of interpret it with the idea that each person in that system and that structure has that sense of well-being, something that positive peace refers to, but again gets very, very difficult on the ground when you're bringing it from the macro to the micro level to really see how that kind of equality goes. The other problem that often comes along with structural violence, again referred to by Galtung, which he says are the two big challenges, that of trauma and unresolved conflict, is often tied to the idea of cultural violence. And structural violence and cultural violence go hand in hand. So if you're looking at cultural violence and what that role that is playing, you've begun to understand the idea that the government has slogans around education for all and how we are going to encourage more people to go to education. But you can't really change at the community level that Muslim parent who's terrified to send their daughter to school because of the trauma that they have carried about what can happen to their community. The unresolved conflict that has never really addressed those sources of those conflict, but has jumped on to development as, jumping on the development slogan, and then you go forward from there. So how do you get that girl to go to school? How do you get those parents to deal with that trauma? How do you get that unresolved conflict that has never been addressed? So it raises questions around this strong government and a structural violence that cannot necessarily ensure a just peace or a sustainable peace. So those are some of the kinds of challenges that I think about when I'm researching on positive peace and what that really looks down at the community level.
Thank you, Pushpa. I think that will lead well into Ev's comments, where he's going to reflect a bit on memory as well.
Great, thank you very much. First, I have 4 quick points, and the first 2 are sort of very, very positive things, and I think the second 2 are challenges. The first is, in front of folks from the IEP, I feel like I have to say this. I cite the Global Peace Index and the Mexico Peace Index regularly in very specific contexts. For example, it's incredibly useful. I've been an expert witness in about 50 asylum cases in the last 4 years. Asylum cases from Mexico, it's the lowest grant rate for any sending country, and they're effective. The ability to show an immigration judge who may just be back from a spring break vacation in Mexico that on the Global Peace Index, Mexico is in the same neighborhood as Lebanon is powerful. A wealthy and cosmopolitan place that also has a serious epidemic of violence. I think that Mexico is emblematic of something that Frank and Steve and others have pointed out today, this real gap between positive and negative peace. So it's incredibly useful, and we need to continue to support and enrich that work. The second thing I would say relates to the positive peace part. And this is something that I'll use an example from the Mexico Peace Index, and that's about how we prioritize our resources as peace builders and how we look at how effective we are and measure products and investments against each other. If you look at the Mexico Peace Index and you look at the gap between negative and positive peace, it's really illustrative. If you look at a state like Guerrero in the south, well, Guerrero is easy because it ranks last among Mexican states in positive peace and negative peace. But if you look at Sinaloa, where I do a lot of work, it's in the top 10 in Mexico in positive peace. And yet it's always in the bottom 2 or 3 in negative peace, has a crisis of violence. Same thing is true for Nuevo León, where Monterrey is, for Baja Sur, and other places in northern Mexico. And to me, that, in terms of planning the deployment of peace-building resources, it means that in those places where there's a gap, that's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to leverage the strengths of those places. And it's also a warning that we don't need to create new institutions wholesale in those places. Whereas in Guerrero, actually just focusing on poverty and poverty alleviation might be justified. So I think that getting the right size and the right emphasis is one of the, especially by looking at the gap between negative and positive peace, can be very, very powerful, and I'm happy to share further examples of that. The third point I'd like to make is really a challenge, and this is the challenge of the problem behind all of this, right? The problem of violence and how we measure it. When we try to create these comparative metrics, as useful as they are, when we look at violence, we measure it almost exclusively by incidence. And because we have to, or we feel that we have to. And the problem with that is that all of the research on violence and the research on trauma in particular shows us that the actual experience and the articulation of that experience socially is incredibly subjective. Not all murders are the same. I mean, and we would accept this at a basic human level, and humanists have, about 1,000 years of scholarship and created lots of different ways of looking at this. But it's really, it's a challenge, and it's something that goes beyond what we're doing with the incidences. And so let me just give you a couple of examples. So if you look at Culiacán, Sinaloa, where I have my biggest project, I run a peace building program there, and you compare it with Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up. If you look at the first 10 years of what's called the drug war in Mexico, they have the same homicide rate. Basically averages out. Detroit, Culiacan. Well, that's interesting in and of itself. I think that people in Detroit might say, yeah, we'd like people to talk about that. But of course, the experience is not the same. There are two huge variables here that are different in these two places. The one is the impunity rate. The impunity rate for homicide in Sinaloa is 98%. Right? The homicide clearance rate, which is the opposite measure, in the US we use the opposite measure, in Detroit never dipped below 50%, and 50% was epically bad, and it's now over 90% in fact. So there's the impunity rate in and of itself, whether whether crimes are investigated and punished. But the second piece is the spectacle. It's what happens to violence when it's video recorded and put on the internet, or when the body of a victim is hung from a pedestrian bridge with a terrifying note on it, when the local media are threatened not to publish the names of the victims. This is something that didn't happen in Detroit. And that is just a subjective difference in the experience that we can't capture with incidents. And that's so the real challenge is, how do we come up with some subjective metrics? And I think the everyday peace indicators are great. We actually use one in Sinaloa. It's just, do you let your kids go to their friends' houses at night, and a set of other questions that came out of survey data. Very similar methodology, and I think that's really important. And this leads to sort of the fourth point and the second challenge. And that's the challenge of, okay, so what do you do? How do you collect those experiences? Me, I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm helping to launch the first Citizens Truth Commission in Mexico and Sinaloa. We're going to take long-form ethnographic testimonials from victims. And let me just explain to you, again, sort of underscore this, but then make a suggestion of how it might relate to positive peace. Last summer, we have a monthly roundup of the security data in Sinaloa, where the security officials and researchers get together and talk about what progress is being made on what kinds of violent crime, which rates have gotten better or worse. And I was invited to come and talk at this one on auto theft. And I have to tell you, I was not particularly excited to travel and stay in a hotel and miss my kids for a night to go sit through a panel with police officers talking about auto theft. It just didn't, whereas if it had been forced disappearances or torture or something else, I might have been more excited about that. And I was totally wrong. And I was totally wrong because, again, I was looking at incidents. As a part of the program, we invited 2 victims to come and testify. And they said something that I never would have thought. In auto theft in Sinaloa, 3/4 of the time, about 75% of the time, involves the kidnapping of the driver. You can't see that with incidents. When you hear a testimonial for someone saying that they've been taken, held against their will for half a day, beaten up, blindfolded, and dropped in another town, 60 kilometers away, without their shoes and their phone, and thought they were going to die, auto theft incidents doesn't seem to measure that. So I think it's important, and the relation to the positive peace, and this is exactly what we're doing with our Truth Commission starting in January, we're not going to come up with some universal metric that could be applied for all testimonials. There's no way to do that, and it would be a fool's errand. But one thing we have noticed, and I feel like I've heard this from researchers all over the world, is that the act of giving that testimony has positive value that you can show empirically. And we could measure and include in something like positive peace, have people been able to tell these stories? Has someone accompanied them? And measure the kinds of fora in which they've been able to do this. Were they public? Were they private? Were they threatened afterwards or not threatened afterwards? Did it change their outcomes? So in other words, I do think that there is a quantitative complement, and I'm not sure it fits in the current pillars of positive peace, but I think there are ways in which it might.
Thanks to our panelists, I was reminded to alert participants that if you are tweeting from this conference, you can use the hashtag #PositivePeace2018. So please use that hashtag if you're tweeting. What I think linked everybody's comments today was the role and experience of the individual. So how does the individual experience negative or positive peace? How do they experience violence in their community, or how do they experience resilience and peace systems? And how can we overlay those experiences and that individual level or community level with this macro framework? What does it tell us in terms of how we can organize our thinking around investments? So while we are talking a lot about bringing grassroots level or individual level information up into a global macro framework, we are all sitting here at Stanford, not sitting within a community that we may be discussing today. So I'm sort of curious for the panel to comment from their experiences a little bit how you think from a research or academic practitioner perspective, which you all represent, how we can start to sort of move into thinking more about those factors of resilience and strengthening them, because that's where I think there's a big challenge here. It's easier to talk about violence and conflict, and as Ev mentioned, it's easier to count incidents. But what we're trying to do is also understand where are those sources of positive peace and those strengths of positive peace, either from the macro measured level or at the individual or community level. So what are the elements, let's say from everyday peace indicators, that are sources of peace that can be looked at the community level to strengthen up? Are there any examples there? Where are there perhaps levers for international movements, NGOs, or governments even to influence the positive peace environment around grassroots organization and nonviolent resistance? Ev has mentioned some indications of where we can think about including reconciliation initiatives and individual experiences in this. And for Pushpa as well, how do we think about this when we're talking about complex societies, such as some of the examples you mentioned in India, where we're never going to have a cause and effect? And as Steve talked about earlier with systems thinking, how can we think about this in a more systemic way so that we are nudging forward the system and not just trying to make an intervention that will have potentially negative effects? So my question is really, how do you think we can move towards more understanding of positive peace at the individual or community level, and how we can make that shift into focusing then more resources and actions, even if that's more studies on those elements of strengths and resiliences? If anybody has any comments.
One is, I think that it's useful to frame it in opposition, and not so much in opposition to negative peace, which we do all the time, but to think about the alternatives, which is the securitization, right? That's really, that's really the competitor here, frankly, in terms of the intellectual model, but also in terms of how states think about this, how public policy thinks about this, and how this is internalized and supports the authoritarian movements. And so I'll give you one example. If you look at domestic violence in contemporary Mexico, when the homicide rate ticked down, which it did from 2012 to 2015, rates of domestic violence continued to climb. Actually, it's out of step. And it's been widely noted now that there's kind of this crisis of domestic violence. Well, what does that have to do with the overall security crisis? Well, I admit I'm not an expert on domestic violence, and I kind of went to the literature, and I came across a classic sociological study that asked a question. And it's a question I often ask my students. I say, it's now become like my standard trivia. They ask my students, I said, well, what technological invention can be most directly linked to a rise in domestic violence in the US, in US history? It's the air conditioner. It's the air conditioner, because it took public forms of sociability that acted as a check on domestic violence, and it pushed people into private space. And so if you have people in private space and there's some external stressor, you get more domestic violence. And there's a really good long-term regression that shows this. If you look at contemporary Mexico, the drug war has pushed people into private space. And actually, it's related to securitization and to positive peace because many of the measures that we have taken to make people safer, building walls, Sinaloa, for example, Culiacan is absolutely a city of walls. Walls within walls within walls within walls. It looks like a Brazilian city, actually, more than a Mexican city. I think there's a good empirical argument, and we obviously have to prove this, but that it actually increased this other form of violence. And I think that those are the kinds of juxtapositions that support a more integral systems approach based on positive peace.
So first of all, one thing about the everyday peace indicators is that we don't specify whether the indicators should be positive or negative measures. And one of the really interesting things that we found when we analyzed the indicators that come up is that whether a community tends to use more positive or negative indicators of peace has to do with how far they are in time, how removed they are from the conflict. So when the conflict is in the very, very recent memory, most of the indicators that people use have to do with whether or not there is violence, right? So there's a classic negative measures of peace, right? Is there an absence of violence or is there not an absence of violence? But when there's more distance in time from actual armed conflict, the measures of peace that we get are things like whether or not people's needs are being met by the state, right? Whether or not public services are being offered, and those relate much more closely to the positive, the pillars of positive peace, and also with Pushpa's comments about the needs of ordinary people being met, right? Sort of this justice sort of perspective, or social justice perspective. I also want to bring my comments back a bit to some of the things that Frank was saying at the very opening of the conference about the different ways of thinking about what a strong state is. One of the classic definitions in political science of a state is about whether or not the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, right? So a lot of times we think about that sort of authority of the state about that, whether or not they have a monopoly on violence. But really the key piece there, and this is where the positive peace part comes in, is the legitimacy piece, right? Whether or not people recognize the authority of the state. And sometimes that has to do with how well the state is delivering on that state-society compact. Is the state providing for the citizens? And so I've got another research project that's really looking at that state-society compact, whether or not in the delivery of public services we can build up peace. And so I think that's where the thinking about the needs of ordinary people meet the sort of systems perspective or the top-down perspective comes in.
On the resilience question, I can't help but be moved by the way civil society, even in the most authoritarian situations, has been able to deal creatively in nonviolent resistance. And it's not just in relatively developed countries like in Eastern Europe, but in places like, in the past 30 years, the most impressive pro-democracy struggles have taken place in places like Benin and Mali and Burkina Faso, which would rank low on a lot of measures, at least in terms of development issues. But and we hear a lot about, sometimes you hear Western analysts talking about, the Facebook revolution or the Twitter revolution, about how technology is necessary for this. So I remember in Mali when they overthrew the Traor regime back in the early 90s, they didn't have the social media. In fact, the majority of the population was illiterate. They used griots, the traditional singing storytellers, to go from village to village and help build the pro-democracy movement. Another piece around resilience, I think, is to it really, I think, comes down strategically. Why we say, nonviolence didn't work in China. Look at the Tiananmen Square massacre. But we've seen in from East Germany to Tunisia, the Philippines. When they've faced these massive civil insurrections, the dictators have ordered troops to massacre people, and they refused. So I think that's why many people are looking at the whole thing about defections and loyalty shifts and how that works. And similarly, look at Poland. They succeeded where Chinese students didn't. Why? Instead of occupying, if they massively occupied downtown Warsaw and demanded the end of communism, they would have probably been massacred too. But they were strategic. They started taking over the shipyards at Gdansk. They simply demanded a free trade union movement, but through the free trade union movement, they were able to build these millions and millions of people from across the country joined, and they got these great networks and organizing tools. And so when martial law came down, they were strong enough and resilient enough to go underground, and then eventually bring down the system because they thought strategically. So just like in a guerrilla army is not going to win victory by immediately storming the capital. They're going to seek refuge. They'll do some small hit and run actions, build cadre, in the rural areas before they can get to that point. Similarly, with nonviolence, like violence, doesn't work per se. It has to be strategic. And on average, nonviolent resistance is more effective, but you have to think strategically. So just like anything else, I think a lot of resilience, the ability to be resilient, has to do with your ability to sequence your tactics, think strategically, measure your strengths and weaknesses, the state's strengths and weaknesses, and go on from there. And just one very, very briefly, we've seen even in serious conflict zones, like in Colombia, where the people established these autonomous peace communities where they refused to allow their young men to be conscripted or to pay taxes or give any support for either the guerrillas or the government or the drug lords or the right-wing paramilitaries. And similar from the Guatemalan highlands to the Niger Delta, even in places like Yemen and Syria, where you've seen pockets where we had these so-called fragmented tyrannies of violence coming from all directions, people still able to organize and resist nonviolently. And I think let's never underestimate the ability of people, even in difficult situations, to resist if they have solidarity, if they think strategically, and they have the motivation.
Thank you.
I can keep mine really brief. I also want to start with resilience. So, around the same time as the London bombings, train bombings took place, there were bombings in Mumbai. And do you know that in less than 30 minutes, the bodies had been removed, the platforms had been washed, and the trains started running again. So resilience takes a different meaning when you're talking about communities that simply do not have the luxury to mourn, to think about their trauma, or to reflect on it, on what they have just gone through. So when I think of some of those kinds of communities, I think the kinds of indicators we develop for resilience must vary. We must think about it very differently when we are talking about those everyday or community-based indicators for some of these different pillars. So I really think, if you're looking at it from the perspective of how we can build it bottom up, a lot of it is doing some of the kinds of things you were talking about, maybe quantitatively even, although, things like trauma, I struggle to think how we can quantify that, trauma healing, and how we can really measure those kinds of things. But the idea really is indicators that come up from the communities themselves, and communities have a chance also to reflect on the systemic pillars, the systemic indicators, like can they comment on what they think is a strong government? If we can develop the indicators that kind of help the community to speak for those macro indicators, then I think that there is more hope of us developing a more systemic positive piece.
Thank you. We'll open it up to some questions from the audience. We have the mics going around again.
Hi, Marin O'Brien, Bell Hussein with Search for Common Ground. And thank you for the presentation. My question's for Naomi. I'd be curious to hear more about how you're defining community in the Everyday Peace Indicators Project, particularly from your presentation. It sounds like it's a geographic definition, but as we know, conflict has forced lots of people who would traditionally identify with a particular geographic area or community to move. How are you tracking these people?
It's a really good question. a lot of the EPI work that has happened so far has taken place in much more rural areas, and so it is a geographically defined community. I think that part of the challenge, I've come into the project after it had already launched, and part of my puzzle that I'm trying to work out here is how do we take something that was developed in this to measure peace at a community level where the community is very isolated from the rest of it's a clear geographic boundary around it, and scale it to a larger level, and also handle situations where, say, you want to use EPI processes in a much more urban environment. It becomes really challenging. So it's a very good question, and we're trying to take baby steps as we develop this, is basically my best answer I can give you.
I'm Phyllis Blease with the NGO Peace Through Commerce. Very happy to be here. I love the data. And you talked about the unresolved conflict, like the girl who you wanted to see how she gets to school. And I'm wondering if in either the 8 pillars of peace or in your own work, you have a plan of action for unpacking that, understanding it, and helping resolve that unresolved pain and conflict.
Yeah, I think on the community level, the various organizations that I work for in India, particularly one among them that had social justice as its goals, what we talked about, was really at the community level. When we talk about unresolved conflict and trauma, there's a lot of work to be done with reconciliation, to bring the communities back together, to get them to be able to come together as a force, to become that one community that can actually talk about these indicators in the same way. Otherwise, the indicators mean very different things to both of those communities, to the Hindu community or to the Muslim community. So it's really about how you can bring these communities together in order that they feel like they are one, and then they can talk about a strong government and what that strong government looks like. Otherwise, the relationship with the government is very different for the different communities. And I think that's where the problem lies. So a lot of our work was actually to bring them together, that idea of Galtung's idea of harmony within, which extends to the idea of within as all of us, and not as looking at each of the communities separately.
So, Harvey, did you do meditative practices? Did you prepare them for the conversation that way?
Yeah, so a lot of, not meditative practices, but a lot of it is about community interactions together. How can you really get the two communities to interact? They're very polarized, it's very ghettoized communities. There's no interaction between them. So a lot of our work was really how can you bring them together and actually have conversations among them. It's not an interreligious kind of work, because we realized very quickly interreligious dialogue doesn't really work at the community level. When you bring in leaders, they are happy to talk to each other, but the community has still a lot of different questions among them, and then there is intra-religious kinds of tensions that they have to work through. So a lot of our work was working within each community, then bringing the two communities together, building dialogues, organizing events in such a way that they had other things to look forward to together, as opposed to looking forward to as their own individual goals.
Rounded out opportunity to complete that process?
Sorry, I'll just answer that very quickly.
Yes,
it's a very, very long process. It's a very, very long process, and it's not linear. It goes back and forth.
Hi, my name is Carlos Lemos. I work for the Carter Center. And it was very interesting to hear your presentation, Dr. Levy. And it sounds like you answered one of the questions I have was, what was the rationale behind choosing a community, a Reservoir community, because their experience with the peace process implementation and the same line with the armed conflict is very different from other resguardos and even other rural communities. So my question is, how do you, is your research and your project going to change, as we all know that the peace process is under huge challenges right now with the new administration, and also, are you working or have any connections with Kroc Institute in the sense that they're named in the peace process as one of those institutions that are there to measure the implementation?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our selection of the resguardos, the 6 resguardos that we're doing the EPI in, we used what we refer to as a most different systems design. So we took a bunch of different community level indicators, things like levels of violence, levels of intervention, or histories of violence and histories of intervention, diversity in the resguardo. We tried to look at things like main industries and such, but most of these are incredibly rural and are farming communities. But yeah, we kind of stratified all the different resguardos on these indicators, and we are on these community level factors, and then we randomly selected the resguardos from those different sort of cells of our typology. But then there's also negotiation with our local partners and where they could actually carry out the research. And so there's all kinds of issues. But what we were trying to do is get from amongst the 32 different resguardos where the Pasto live, 6 that have as many different kinds of characteristics as we can, so that then we're producing a lot of different kinds of indicators to feed into the survey. So that's how we're doing that. I don't actually know whether we have. So Pamina Fershau is the PI on the project, and I don't know if she has any sort of collaboration with Kroc. The EPI scaling project is currently funded by the Carnegie Corporation, and it is this partnership with the group that approached Pamina that they wanted to run EPI anyway, and we had funding to pay them to do it, and so it's very much a collaboration there. I don't know if that answers your question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Madeline Rose with Mercy Corps. My question is for Professor Zunes. Sorry. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the autonomous peace communities research.
Yeah.
Mercy Corps has done some work on sort of trying to understand individual levels of resilience to recruitment in conflict zones and the differences, but haven't been able to do as much community level resilience. So why some communities can kind of push off Boko Haram, for example, is what we were looking at. So just would love to hear more on that research track.
Yeah. Unfortunately, this is not research I've done myself. This is research I'm familiar with for some others. I think a couple things that have helped them in cases of so-called fragmented tyrannies. One is solidarity within the community. I mean, the fact that people, there's a broad consensus of this kind of resistance. And that they have allies, both in urban parts of Colombia. I mean, Benue paralleled a resistance movement by young Colombians to resist military conscription, even in urban areas. But also, they had a network of supporters for reasons I'm not quite sure. There was a broad network among the Catholic pacifist community in Italy. They had a huge network of solidarity work with Colombia, and they had people going over there all the time. And we've seen these nonviolent peace forces, the Peace Brigades International and groups like that going into conflict zones. So having international presence, can sometimes help in terms of getting media out. I think it also involves in many ways having what you call parallel institutions or alternative institutions where there is a democratic self-governance, like in the peace communities in Colombia. They have their own. They're basically working autonomously with the government in terms of self-governance, democratic self-governance, and also conflict dispute resolution and stuff, or just normal issues that come up within any kind of a municipality, that they have a grassroots democratic structure. So having that kind of resilience, have a base for it, not just everybody saying we're not going to cooperate, but have alternatives where people can put their energy, recognize there are other ways of building and transforming society. Indeed, we've seen in a lot of these movements, the most exciting aspects of nonviolent movements are not the million people on the streets or whatever that get in the news coverage in the final hours of a regime or something like that, but the organizing that takes place on a one-to-one level, on a neighborhood-to-neighborhood level, on the grassroots level, because especially in oppressive situations, sometimes going out in the street in mass is not the easiest way to do. Sometimes it's lower risk actions like non-cooperation, for example, and building these alternative institutions for, in some ways, for cultural, economic, self-help, any number of levels.
Great. I'd like to close our panel, thank our panelists, and then we'll move into our lightning talks. Thank you.